The year was 1803. The United States was still a young nation. At that time, its borders stretched only from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. But President Thomas Jefferson had a bigger dream. He wanted America to expand westward, giving its people more land, more opportunities for farming, and better trade routes. The challenge was that all the land west of the Mississippi River, the vast Louisiana Territory, belonged to France. This land was enormous, covering areas that would later become more than 15 U.S. states. Jefferson worried that if France restricted access to the Mississippi River, it would choke America's trade and growth. So, Jefferson sent diplomats to Paris to negotiate. Their original goal was simple: buy New Orleans and a small portion of land nearby, just enough to secure trade. But then came a huge twist. France was under the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was busy fighting wars in Europe. Napoleon needed money, fast. So instead of just New Orleans, he shocked the Americans by offering the entire Louisiana Territory. The negotiators could hardly believe their astonished face. This was one of the biggest land deals in history. And the price? Just $15 million, an incredibly low amount for such an enormous stretch of land. This deal became known as the Louisiana Purchase. Overnight, it nearly doubled the size of the United States. But with this opportunity came a mystery. What exactly was out there in this new land? What rivers, mountains, animals, and native tribes lived there? To answer those questions, Jefferson called on two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to lead an expedition into the unknown. And thus began the legendary journey that would change America forever. After the Louisiana Purchase, America suddenly owned a massive stretch of land, but no one really knew what it contained. Maps were blank, rivers were unmapped, mountains were a mystery, and the native tribes who lived there were unknown to the government. President Thomas Jefferson understood that this land could shape the future of the nation. But before America could settle or trade there, it needed answers. So Jefferson decided to send a team on a bold mission into the wilderness. This mission would have several purposes. 1. Scientific exploration. Jefferson was fascinated by nature. He wanted the explorers to record new animals, plants, minerals, and landscapes. Could there be giant rivers for trade? Could the land support farming? Were there new species no one had ever seen before? 2. Geographic discovery. At that time, people dreamed of a Northwest Passage, a water route that might connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. If such a route existed, America could open trade directly with Asia. Jefferson ordered the explorers to find out. 3. Relations with native tribes. Jefferson also wanted peaceful contact with the native nations. He hoped to establish trade, build alliances, and show that the United States had now become the rightful owner of this new territory. 4. Political and strategic goals. By sending an expedition, Jefferson wanted to prove that America could explore and control its own land without depending on Europe. It was a message of confidence from a young nation to the world. For this ambitious mission, Jefferson chose Meriwether Lewis, his trusted personal secretary, and William Clark, a skilled soldier and mapmaker. Together, they would lead what became known as the Corps of Discovery, a group of about 40 men who would risk their lives venturing into the unknown. No one knew what dangers awaited: wild animals, hostile tribes, harsh weather, or endless miles of wilderness. But the purpose was clear: to explore, to discover, and the year was 1803, and the mission was clear: explore the Louisiana Territory. But before Lewis and Clark could begin, they needed to prepare for a journey into the unknown, thousands of miles across rivers, mountains, and wilderness no American had ever seen. Meriwether Lewis took charge of gathering supplies. He studied medicine, botany, astronomy, and survival skills so he could treat injuries, record discoveries, and navigate the land. He even bought scientific instruments like compasses, sextants, and chronometers to measure distances and map the territory. William Clark, on the other hand, was a master of discipline and leadership. His job was to organize the men who would form the Corps of Discovery. Most of them were soldiers, tough, experienced, and able to hunt, row, and fight if necessary. In total, about 40 men were chosen. Their preparations were intense. They needed food, weapons, and tools for a journey that might last years. They carried rifles, powder, fishing gear, and axes. For trade and peace with native tribes, they packed beads, mirrors, ribbons, and medals with President Jefferson's image, symbols of friendship from the United States. They also needed boats. Clark oversaw the building of a 55-foot keelboat, with sails, oars, and even a small cabin. This massive boat would carry tons of supplies up the Missouri River, the first stage of their journey. But the preparations were not just about equipment. The Corps had to be mentally ready too. They knew they might face storms, diseases, wild animals, and hostile encounters. Once they left, there would be no easy way back. By the spring of 1804, everything was ready. The men were trained, the supplies were packed, and the great keelboat stood waiting on the banks of the Missouri River. They were no longer just soldiers or explorers, they were about to become part of history. With courage, curiosity, and determination, the Corps of Discovery prepared to step into the great unknown. On the morning of May 14, 1804, the great journey finally began. From the small frontier town of St. Louis, Missouri, the Corps of Discovery pushed off into the wide, rolling waters of the Missouri River. For many, this was the last sight of civilization they would see for years. At the front of the expedition was their huge 55-foot keelboat, loaded with supplies, food, rifles, tools, scientific instruments, and gifts for native tribes. Alongside it were smaller canoes, carrying men who rowed hard against the strong current. Progress was slow, sometimes only a few miles in an entire day. The river itself was unpredictable. Sandbars shifted, currents twisted, and giant tree trunks floated dangerously downstream. Every mile forward was a struggle. The men had to pull with ropes from the shore, push with poles in the mud, and sometimes even get into the icy water to drag the boats along. But the challenges weren't just physical. The weather tested them too, scorching heat in the summer, sudden storms that rocked their boats, and swarms of mosquitoes that made sleep nearly impossible. Still, spirits were high. Each day felt like stepping into a new world. The land was wild and untouched, endless forests, wide prairies, and skies so vast it seemed they stretched forever. The men kept detailed journals, noting the animals they saw: beavers, deer, wolves, even great herds of buffalo. The Corps also knew they weren't alone. Along the riverbanks, native tribes watched their strange boats drift past. Some encounters were friendly, others tense, but each meeting was a reminder that this was not empty land, it was home to many nations. At night, the explorers camped on river islands. They cooked, repaired equipment, and listened to Clark's orders for the next day. Around the fire, they joked, sang, and wondered what lay ahead. As weeks turned into months, one thing became clear: this was no ordinary expedition. It was the beginning of a journey that would test their endurance. As the Corps of Discovery pushed deeper along the Missouri River, they knew it was only a matter of time before they would meet the people who had lived on this land for centuries: the native tribes. These encounters would be some of the most important and delicate moments of the expedition. The first major meeting came in the summer of 1804, with the Oto and Missouri tribes near present-day Nebraska. Lewis and Clark prepared carefully. They dressed in their finest uniforms, polished their weapons, and raised the American flag. When the native leaders arrived, the captains spoke through interpreters, offering peace medals with President Jefferson's face, along with beads, cloth, and tobacco. This meeting was meant to send a message: the land now belonged to the United States, but the government wished for peace and friendship. The tribes listened, accepted gifts, and shared food, beginning a cautious relationship. Later that year, the Corps reached the powerful Teton Sioux, near today's South Dakota. This meeting was far more tense. The Sioux were strong warriors and controlled much of the river trade. They were suspicious of the Americans, wondering why strangers had entered their territory with such large boats and weapons. At one point, the Sioux chiefs demanded that the explorers leave a boat behind as a toll. The atmosphere grew heated, hands reached for weapons, voices rose, and it seemed a fight might break out. But Lewis and Clark kept calm, using firmness mixed with diplomacy. After days of uneasy talks, the two sides finally parted without bloodshed, but the message was clear: not every tribe would welcome them. These encounters revealed the complexity of the journey. The Corps was not only mapping rivers and recording plants, they were diplomats, trying to build trust with nations that had their own traditions, power, and pride. A single mistake could have ended the expedition before it truly began. As they moved on, Lewis and Clark reminded their. By the winter of 1804, the Corps of Discovery had built Fort Mandan near present-day North Dakota. It was here that Lewis and Clark met someone who would change the fate of their expedition, a young Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. Sacagawea was just a teenager, but her life had already been full of hardship. Years earlier, she had been captured by another tribe and later became the wife of a French-Canadian trader named Toussaint Charbonneau. When Lewis and Clark learned she spoke Shoshone, they realized she could be the bridge they desperately needed, because the Corps would soon cross Shoshone territory, where horses were essential for crossing the Rocky Mountains. Sacagawea joined the expedition with her newborn baby, Jean-Baptiste, carried on her back. At first, some doubted whether a young mother could survive the hardships of such a dangerous journey. But soon, Sacagawea proved herself to be one of the most valuable members of the team. She knew the land. She could find roots, berries, and plants to eat when supplies ran low. She recognized medicinal herbs that helped treat wounds and sickness. She identified landmarks and trails, guiding the explorers through places they might have otherwise been lost. But perhaps her greatest contribution was symbolic. Traveling with a woman and her baby signaled peace. To many native tribes, this showed the expedition was not a war party, but a group seeking friendship and discovery. That simple presence often prevented conflict before it even began. In one dramatic moment, while crossing a river, their boat nearly capsized. Supplies, maps, and precious journals tumbled toward the water. Sacagawea, with her baby on her back, calmly rescued important papers and instruments, saving months of work from being lost forever. Later, when the Corps finally met the Shoshone, Sacagawea discovered that the chief was her own brother. This emotional reunion not only gave the explorers the horses they desperately needed but also SEC. By the summer of 1805, the Corps of Discovery had reached the edge of the Great Rocky Mountains. From a distance, the peaks looked like white clouds resting on the horizon. But as the explorers drew closer, they realized the truth. These were no ordinary hills. This was a towering wall of stone, snow, and wilderness stretching as far as the eye could see. Crossing them would be the greatest challenge of the entire expedition. At first, the Shoshone tribe, with Sacagawea's help, provided the Corps with horses. These animals were essential, because boats could no longer carry them through the rushing, dangerous rivers of the mountains. With the horses, the explorers loaded supplies and began the long climb upward. The journey was brutal. Trails were steep, narrow, and slippery. The men often had to lead the horses by hand, sometimes dragging them up rocky paths or across icy streams. Snow still lingered on the peaks, even in summer, and freezing winds cut through their clothes. Food quickly became a problem. Game was scarce, and hunting was nearly impossible in the rugged terrain. The men grew weak from hunger, at times boiling candles or eating dried horse meat just to survive. Exhaustion set in. Journals described men collapsing from fatigue, their faces hollow from lack of food. Even Sacagawea, carrying her infant, trudged alongside them, never giving up despite the hardship. But in these moments of near despair, the team's unity mattered most. Lewis and Clark encouraged the men, reminding them of the mission's importance. The promise of reaching the Pacific, and the honor of completing their country's greatest journey, kept them moving. After weeks of grueling struggle, they finally reached the western slopes of the Rockies. There, they found the Nez Perce tribe, who offered them food, shelter, and guidance. This kindness may have saved the expedition from collapse. The Rockies had tested everything: strength, courage, and endurance. Many times, it seemed after months of hardship in the Rockies, the Corps of Discovery finally descended into the river valleys of the Pacific Northwest. Here they faced a new challenge: the fierce and unpredictable waters of the Columbia River. The river was powerful, crashing through canyons with roaring rapids. The men had to steer their dugout canoes with precision, often risking their lives as waves smashed against rocks. Supplies were nearly lost more than once, and the icy spray soaked them to the bone. Still, they pressed forward, driven by the dream of reaching the ocean. As they traveled downstream, the land began to change. Towering evergreen forests stretched endlessly, and salmon leapt from the rivers in numbers the explorers had never seen. The journals described these scenes with awe. This was a world unlike anything back east. Finally, in November 1805, after more than a year and a half of struggle, Lewis, Clark, and their men stood on a windswept shore. Before them lay the vast, endless waters of the Pacific Ocean. For a moment, they could hardly believe it. They had done what few thought possible. They had crossed an entire continent. Some of the men shouted with joy, others wept, and all felt the weight of history. Lewis wrote in his journal that the sight was the object of our long, labored voyage. But their excitement was tempered by reality. The Pacific coast was stormy, with relentless rain and crashing waves. The men were cold, hungry, and exhausted. Winter was coming, and they had to decide where to stay. Still, reaching the ocean was a triumph. They had fulfilled Jefferson's dream, mapping a path across the continent, proving the vastness of America, and opening the door for future exploration and settlement. The core of discovery had reached the edge of the world. But their journey was only half over, because they still had to survive the long return home. By late November 1805, the core of discovery had finally reached the Pacific Ocean. But the celebration was short-lived. Cold winds, pounding rain, and crashing waves made it impossible to stay on the open coast. They needed shelter, a safe place to spend the long winter. The captains held a rare vote among the men, and even Sacagawea was allowed to give her opinion. Together, they decided to build a camp on the south side of the Columbia River, in present-day Oregon. There, among tall forests of cedar and fir, they constructed a wooden fort. They named it Fort Clatsop, after the local Clatsop tribe. Life at Fort Clatsop was harsh. Rain fell almost every day. The air was damp, the mud endless, and the men's clothes never fully dried. Hunting was difficult, elk and deer were scarce, and what little meat they found spoiled quickly in the wet weather. Many of the men grew sick, coughing from colds and fevers. Despite the hardships, the winter was productive. Lewis and Clark kept detailed journals, recording everything they had seen so far: plants, animals, rivers, and native customs. Clark spent hours drawing maps, carefully tracing the route they had taken from St. Louis to the Pacific. They also built relationships with nearby tribes, trading for food and learning about the coastal region. Still, tensions sometimes rose. Some tribes were friendly, others cautious, and a few demanded high prices for supplies. The Corps had to balance diplomacy with survival. Inside the fort, time passed slowly. The men repaired weapons, mended clothes, and told stories around smoky fires. Sacagawea cared for her infant son, while her presence continued to remind the men of the peace they needed to maintain. By March 1806, after more than 3 months of cold and rain, the Corps knew it was time to leave. Supplies were running out, and the dream of returning home burned in every heart. They had reached the Pacific. Now they had to find their way back across the continent. Fort Clatsop. In March 1806, after a long and stormy winter at Fort Clatsop, the Corps of Discovery packed their supplies, left the fort behind, and began the journey home. They had reached the Pacific Ocean, but their mission wasn't complete until they made it back to St. Louis with their maps, journals, and discoveries. The return trip was no less challenging. The men paddled upriver against strong currents, hunted for food in rugged forests, and once again crossed the freezing, snow-covered Rocky Mountains. Hunger returned, and exhaustion tested them daily. To move faster, Lewis and Clark decided to split the Corps into 2 groups, exploring different routes back east. Lewis led one party toward the Meriwether River in Montana, while Clark guided the other along the Yellowstone River. By covering more ground, They expanded their maps and gathered even more knowledge of the vast land Jefferson had purchased. But the dangers were still real. Lewis was injured in a hunting accident, nearly costing him his life. Hostile encounters with some native groups reminded the Corps that diplomacy was as important as courage. Yet, through determination and unity, both parties eventually reunited on the Missouri River for the final leg of the journey. On September 23, 1806, after more than 2 years and traveling nearly 8,000 miles, the Corps of Discovery finally returned to St. Louis. Crowds cheered as the men, once thought lost, marched back into the city. They were heroes, greeted as symbols of the young nation's courage and ambition. The legacy of their expedition was enormous. They had mapped rivers, mountains, and valleys that no American had ever seen. They had recorded over 200 new plants and animals, and described dozens of native nations with whom they had traded, learned, and sometimes struggled. Most importantly, they had proven that the United States could stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that Jefferson's dream of a continental nation was real. The Lewis and Clark Expedition.